What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a preview of Avowed, which I have played for like 8 to 10 hours, give or take, as well as interviewed a bunch of the developers at Obsidian Entertainment. Now, obviously that comes with a few explanations and a general rundown of what I've played and what this preview consists of, so I will have this timestamped if you just want to get to the juicier part of the video, but it is important that I mention up front. So basically, I was invited by Xbox out to Obsidian Studios in Irvine to, of course, play the game for a couple hours as well as talk to the developers and everything else. So Xbox provided the trip and set it all up. This is the first invitation for anything like that I've ever accepted, which was primarily because it was Obsidian Studios, which are behind many of my favorite games, including the Pillars series, which Avowed is based on, but also Avowed is my most anticipated game, so it was all around a very unique opportunity. Of course, we're going to get into some criticisms and concerns I have with it, as obviously this is a big genre shift, but with all of that said, while I was in Irvine speaking with Obsidian, I only played the game for about 2 hours. Afterwards, they made the game available remotely for a couple of days, where I played it substantially more, which is where most of the footage you're seeing is coming from. And I believe this remote preview was granted to a wider audience as well. I'm not for sure on that, but that was the impression that I got, especially since in terms of people that were actually at the event in Irvine was a pretty small group. With the main difference between those two things being that the people who were actually at the studio, of course, got to interview all of the devs and just speak to them generally about the game. Now, with all of that stuff said, the next thing I want to talk about is exactly what this preview was and what I'm showing you and what we're going over. So basically, the preview for the game was the very first part of it, character creation, the prologue, and the first area that you'll actually be free to run around in, which is Dawnshore, which is where we'll touch base on the living lands. Now, I can talk about character creation and the prologue, which we're of course going to do, but it was requested that we don't show any of that, specifically because a lot of it is still very much work in progress in the build that we had access to. My understanding was that this is actually a little bit older, and they have a more current build that has some changes and stuff, so it's more finalized there, but in this build it was not. And this experience also includes things that hasn't been much discussed yet, such as the third-person view, which we haven't really seen much of at all besides a quick teaser a while back, alongside a host of other detail. Now, if you've never heard of this game at all, Avowed is set in the world of Eora, which is the setting and universe that the two Pillars of Eternity games take place in. I'm a huge fan of it, played those games extensively, made story videos, like a whole lore playlist about them, which is a little bit before I was doing YouTube full time, but it was obviously quite a big deal to me. And to that end, I actually have more videos planned to discuss specific topics as we move through this. In particular, I want to make a video discussing the story and breaking down combat in third person a little more. So there will be some places where I don't give as much detail because I plan on doing a separate video for those things over the next couple of days. Now, from there, let's actually start talking about the game proper and the experience, starting with character creation. Again, this is going to be more of an overview generally, but obviously there's a big cosmetic character creation, and you'll be able to customize your envoy for the Obsidian Empire. Now, your character is always a godlike, but you'll be able to choose between human and elf. So those are the two playable races. If you're unfamiliar with what a godlike is, basically it's a sort of sub-race that can belong to any other race, as it is someone who was touched by one of the gods of Eora while they were still in the womb, and thus they have all sorts of physical manifestations relevant to that god's sphere of power. Now, you being a godlike in this day and age is of note, as they have largely disappeared from the world following the events of Pillars of Eternity 2, but again, we'll cover that in the story video. Now, right away, there are a lot more races involved in this particular world, like the Amawa, which are like scaly humanoids, and then Orlans, your smaller furry type people, and then dwarves, of course, so things like that. We, however, can only play human or elf. I imagine a lot of this is just down to scope. You know, things like animations, etc. But as an envoy of the Obsidian Empire, humans and elves are the predominant people there. So it does make sense lore-wise, but sure, it's definitely a bit disappointing. Now, in terms of important character decisions in character creation, the main thing you're going to be picking here is your background and customizing some stats. So there are 5 different backgrounds, which are Scholar, Augur, Scion, Scout, and War Hero. Now, each of these affects your starting stats, that is to say it distributes them for you, but you can customize that however you please, and it also affects dialogue throughout the game. This seems to come up a lot dialogue-wise, and in fact, it seems to affect your ability to converse intercourse with certain companions a bit more. For instance, the one companion we had access to here, Kai, is an old war veteran. So if you are a war hero, you get a ton of extra dialogue options that allow you to relate to him, just to give an example of one of the ways in which they come up. But outside of cosmetic stuff, that's really the most important part. Now, following this is, of course, the prologue of the game. The prologue, I would say, serves as a really good primer to the universe and also the immediate situation. So obviously, this is aimed at tutorializing new players and getting to terms, I would say, with the overall feel of this particular game. I think they did a pretty good job here. It's as quick and painless as you need it to be if you're really familiar with these types of games, and then if you are really dedicated to learning more about the universe, there's a lot of stuff in there as well, and there's even a hidden room to find. Now, I want to mention that in particular because as this is a game set in a very well-established world, there's a lot of lore to get caught up to date with if you want it, and I think they do a good job of presenting that in a way that isn't going to be overwhelming for a lot of people. Now, to help along with that, when you're in dialogue with people, you can bring up a dialogue history and look up the exact terms they're using, which is something a lot of games do, but I just want to point it out here just because of how well established this world is, and a lot of the terms may be unfamiliar to you. Like, for instance, all of the game's various gods and stuff, and the events of even the previous Pillars games, which will be referenced here and there, even if they are not immediately impactful to the story here. All that to say, I think they did a pretty good job with the prologue itself. Now, story-wise, as I mentioned, we're the godlike envoy of the Adiran Empire, sent to a place called the Living Lands to investigate a mysterious plague called the Dream Scourge. And we're going to get roped into events, obviously, right away as we find ourselves shipwrecked, only to have to find our way to the shore proper in order to start investigating the scourge and the effect it's having on the wildlife and even the people around, causing no shortage of, I would say, distressing situations. In particular, though, a lot of this seems to be manifesting as rot and fungal growths all over stuff that drive people mad before, eventually just killing them outright, and in some cases even reanimating them after the fact in order to force them to continue to prolong these problems. Now, obviously there's more to it than that. I actually have a lot more to say on this, but for the sake of avoiding spoilers for the moment, I'm gonna save that entirely for a separate video. Now, a couple of notes on random stuff here and there. For starters, the game will have difficulty options, story through Path of the Damned, which is the hard mode for the series if you're unaware, and in an interview with some of the developers, we'll talk about much of what they want difficulty to affect is largely not so much enemies becoming health sponges and whatnot, but rather the intensity and pressure that enemies put on you as you are in combat, meaning that you'll have to, of course, engage with more of the core systems, which I thought was interesting. And then a quick note on the technical side of things. So obviously I played this for a fair bit. How's it running? I even played it natively on my own computer personally, so I got a pretty good feel for it. Most of it seems to be in a pretty good place. I would say the biggest issue I ran into personally was that I did experience a fair bit of micro stuttering and then some other minor bugs that were known issues that they were working on, so we'll see if those get fixed between now and the actual launch. But the main thing that concerns me was the micro stuttering, and obviously we're still a little ways out, so hopefully even that will be smoothed out and addressed, but given how common of a problem that is quickly becoming, it can get a little bit annoying. Now, beyond that, in this short preview at least, I really didn't notice any substantial problem that was anything more than a small cosmetic issue. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the progression systems that we see on display here. As we actually start moving, exploring, taking out enemies, completing quests and stuff, we'll of course be leveling up. This gives us the ability to increase our attributes, which are the Pillars of Eternity attributes, as you might imagine, but all pretty standard stuff. It tells you exactly what they do, so I won't bother to explain it here. But then we have your abilities. You'll get an ability point every time you level up to put in one of the ability trees, which are basically Warrior, Ranger, Wizard, alongside a couple others. Now, we do get a godlike skill tree. This is all story related, so it doesn't look like you'll actually be putting any points into this one, but rather you'll find either memories or have certain story choices where you'll get to, either choose what to do there and then potentially pick up a either passive or active ability from the godlike tree as a direct result of that. And then your companions will sometimes get ability points as well, and you'll be able to unlock abilities for them or upgrade the ones they've already got. Now, my main note on the ability tree is that it looks like they really did focus on what tends to be more of the core gameplay in a more action-oriented game, which means classes from Pillars like the Chanters, the Ciphers, shape-shifting for Druids, which would require all the animation work for those shape-shifts, etc., were clearly where they made the cuts. And I think that's going to be a little bit unfortunate for veterans of the Pillars series, just because I know how well liked a lot of those mechanics were. But again, in one of the interviews we will discuss a little bit later, it was mentioned that some of these they felt just didn't fit into an action-oriented game. For instance, a lot of Cypher's abilities might be difficult to translate. And then other stuff like the Druid shapeshifts were basically just scope, because you have to animate every single one of those. But then we have gear. Gear, of course, plays a big role in progression as well. And for the most part, this feels very good. Very Pillars of Eternity in terms of gear progression, actually. So you'll get basic gear, your common items, which includes different types of armor, light, medium, heavy, gloves, shoes, etc. And all of that has various effects, all the different weapon types, etc. And you can upgrade these with materials you'll find while exploring, which will then, of course, make them better. But you can also do this enough until you push these items into the next rarity tier. And that's important because your main armor set, like the chest piece, as well as your weapons, their rarity tiers affect directly how ready you are to engage other enemies in combat. And in fact, you take a damage penalty against enemies that have better gear than you, so upgrading that is very important. But beyond just the basic gear, you will of course find unique items as well. And these unique items have unique effects, as you would expect, but also can be enchanted further to increase or change the effect of that base unique property. This is like directly from Pillars of Eternity, so this should feel familiar to you if you played those games. But enchanting is the mechanism that allows you to upgrade uniques to make them even more unique and suited to your playstyle. As an example, I found a unique sort of lightning-based pistol that I loved and could upgrade to cause it to do shock accumulation to everything around the enemy that I hit, rather than just the enemy I hit. So basically, while it certainly doesn't include everything in terms of what Pillars of Eternity had to offer, the progression systems feel very Pillars of Eternity, which I was happy to see. Next up, let's talk a little bit about Dawnshore, the area which we explored. So this is a relatively tame part of the Living Lands where we set about investigating the Dream Scourge. Now, most of what this opening area does is introduce concepts. The Steel Garrote, paladins of the goddess Woedica, for instance, the Adiran Empire and their relationship with the people who were already in the Living Lands when the Adiran Empire came to set up shop. So there's a bit of a tense situation there. And much of this area and its side quests delve pretty much directly into those things, so you can kind of understand the situation and what you're walking into. But there's a few things I want to mention more generally about the game and, exploring these areas. For starters, exploration seems very fun. Like, there's so much stuff you can go and see and do, and it's very open. Now, this system, if you're unaware, is going to be similar to Obsidian's previous work, Outer Worlds, but bigger by comparison. So the game is not truly open world, but rather you will have several large hubs that serve as different areas of the game you can traverse, the first of which is Dawnshore. So right away, much bigger than the Outer Worlds areas, but also, frankly, just more dense. There was a lot of stuff going on here, and in fact, they very much so built up in addition to wide. That is to say, you could climb all over stuff, you could jump across, traverse all sorts of different things, and while some places are more directly marked, you can be probably pleasantly surprised by just how much you're able to climb and move around things that don't look like you'd be able to initially, which is often how they seem to hide secrets and stuff from you, which I thought was a lot of fun. But there's a lot of verticality to these areas, as well as simply being bigger than the Outer Worlds. What's more, though, right away, I would say there are heavy themes of rot, death, against the backdrop of thriving life, as you would expect from a place called the Living Lands, but also the Dream Scourge, which seems to manifest quite literally as rot. And they play around a lot with that visually, and you're going to see a lot of it. And I actually got to interview some of the artists and stuff who worked on a lot of that, and I had a lot of interesting conversations with them about, trying to make sure the paths were visible to the people who just, say, wanted to do the main story, but also that you could find all this off-the-trail hidden stuff that wasn't really marked or highlighted at all. So basically, while Dawnshore might be a little run-of-the-mill to get started, it's a very fun area, and I wound up enjoying exploring a lot more than I thought I might initially. And what's more, to really drive that home, a lot of the NPCs and stuff you'll talk to can be dealt with in many different ways. A lot of the side quests had multiple outcomes. There was a side quest with a woman who was dealing with a soul malady, a common problem in the world of Pillars of Eternity. Well, not exactly a common problem, but a thing that can happen where someone's soul, via the cycle of reincarnation in this world, gets messed up somehow. So right away we see those themes, and how you deal with that situation can play out in numerous different ways. I dealt with a conflict between pirates and the old Valen Republic, as well as the previously shown off quest Dawn Shredder as part of Gamescom. So in every one of those situations, I had a ton of different options to deal with every situation, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, and it looks like, at the very least, that part is definitely classic Obsidian. Now, what's more though, because this was relatively limited to the first area, we obviously don't see a lot of the big choice and consequence and how that plays out over the course of the game, which I will of course hope to see in the actual game. So in theory, that stuff should cascade into bigger, more impactful choices that, lend themselves to replayability later on. But obviously I didn't see too much of that here. Next up though, let's talk about combat, because there is certainly going to be a lot of it in this particular title. So combat, obviously action, the switch from the isometric CRPGs that the universe was originally is going to be a big part of this. And when they first showed combat, a big bit of feedback that they received, and was pretty much all over the internet about it, in fact, was that combat did not seem very impactful. And from that, they set about responding to that feedback, which we've seen as recently as the Gamescom showcase. And I wanted to address that first because I will say that while it definitely has a little bit of jank and awkward animation here and there, combat feels a lot more impactful than it looks, which is a hard thing to convey over video. But when you're actually attacking things and being hit, when you actually have the controls in your hands and stuff, you can feel a lot of that in a way that, again, is just better than it looks simply being on screen. So hopefully that is something people see when they actually get the chance to play it for themselves, but I was pleasantly surprised by that. But let's talk about a few different other things. So I tried a whole host of different ways to approach combat in my time with this one, and surprisingly, I would say pistol and wand wound up being my favorite parts of it. Basically, you can equip an item to each hand. You can dual wield, you can go sword and board, you can have a two-handed weapon. You can put a grimoire, which is a spell book, which can have its own spells as well as the spells you've learned yourself to use. And then, of course, that is combined with the classless system that gives you all sorts of abilities to make a custom character that feels like a, I would say, multi-classed Pillars character. Because in the isometric Pillars, you could, of course, actually have a wizard who used pistols as an example. So it feels right at home here. Now, the downside to, say, dual wielding is that you won't be able to block, which means you have to rely entirely on dodging out of the way in terms of enemies. So that's something to keep in mind. So shields are obviously more readily able to block incoming enemy hits, which lends itself to some of that intensity in your methods of dealing with it that I mentioned earlier in terms of the difficulty of the game. But as you're hacking away at enemies, you'll be building up a stun meter. When it's full, you'll get to perform a special attack with whatever weapon type you have equipped. So each weapon has its own sort of special stun attack that deals a bunch of extra damage, of course, and, puts a little bit of flourish on the combat. Now, in order to use your abilities, you're going to need Essence. Now, it's called Essence because regardless of the ability type you're actually using, that's what it is. So even if it's a more melee-focused style ability, like, say, Charge, you still need Essence to cast that, which is in addition to a stamina meter. So you will have a stamina meter. Things like your gear can affect how much stamina you're using and how impacted you are by, say, heavy armor, which will theoretically keep you from hacking away indefinitely, and you also need to use that to dodge and the like. So managing that a little bit is going to, of course, be part of the experience. Now, you can also play a more stealth-oriented character if that is your desire. As a base, you get a godlike ability that allows you to stealth attack enemies from behind in melee, though you do have to watch out a little bit. Enemies seem to be decently aware of this, if only because of your companions, if nothing else. But you can get a ranger ability that makes it easier to go invisible in combat and set up these attacks as well. So basically, it is possible to play a stealth-oriented character, so that's definitely worth knowing. Now, magic, on the other hand, is a bit more involved. So your basic magic cast is going to come from grimoires. Grimoires have spells slotted into them that you can then use if you have that equipped. So grimoires come in different types. If you have either the level and the abilities invested, or you have a grimoire in your possession, you can also spend abilities to learn those spells permanently, allowing you to use them even when you don't have that grimoire. So the magic system is present and available, but it is a little bit more involved, and as such, I felt a little odd about investing investing just into it a little bit, as it seems to be a play style that benefits more from a significant investment, at least at face value. So I'll be curious when the game actually drops and releases if that remains to be the case and how well I can integrate magic into like other play styles. So time will tell on that one. But putting all of that in combination with the itemization and how each weapon feels to use and the abilities that you can use, like say just chucking a grenade at things in this one, can be a lot of fun. Another cool thing is that there are actually environmental elemental effects. So we see this a little bit in Traversal with things like spiderwebs that need to be burned down or roots that can be burned out of our way, but also in ways you might not initially expect. One thing I found was that sometimes you can find bars that can be frozen and destroyed that way, and you can also say chuck an ice grenade or use an ice spell to freeze the top of water and walk across it. So while I wouldn't say they are especially plentiful, there are like elemental interactions and ways you can play around with some of these effects that lead to surprising outcomes, which felt pretty fun. Now let's talk about companions, or in this case Kai, as he's the only one I got to experience here. Kai is voiced by the same person that voiced Garrus in Mass Effect, and he is an Amawa who deserted the Rawatayan Navy before coming to the Living Lands. But the reason he deserted the Rawatayan Navy was the most interesting part, because he actually took part in their campaign in Deadfire as part of the second game, where he was not a character, but that's his background, and I thought that was really cool. He also has a very, I would say, disillusioned outlook on war and strife, which is what caused him to desert in the first place, and overall he seems like a really cool character. I can see why they led the game with him. Now, unfortunately, at least in my time with the game, he did not seem particularly useful in combat. In fact, he seemed to die quite a bit, and it didn't always feel like he was making much of an impact damage-wise. Now, this did get a little better once I got geared up, so I'm curious how it would change over the course of the whole game. But I would say, as an overview goes, that's just about everything I had to say on this particular one. So let's talk about pros, cons, and then we'll jump into the interviews portion. So right away, probably the thing I liked most about this is that it feels like the world of Eora, which probably isn't a huge surprise, as a lot of people who worked on those previous games are also working on this one, but they really captured a lot of that feel really, really well, and it feels more like Pillars of Eternity than I was expecting, happily so. And what's more, it feels really great to move around and engage with the combat system, again, more so than I was expecting. And I think if they can deliver that experience while at the same time delivering on choice and consequence and well-written characters within that world, then this game will probably land pretty well overall. But I do have some concerns. For starters, there's a lot of stuff that, just didn't translate from those original games as well, mostly in terms of like classes and playable races and stuff. And however understandable it might be that they're not here, I feel like that's going to wind up being a bit of a letdown. The other thing is companions in combat. I hope they work on this some more in between now and when the game actually releases, but companions did not feel super impactful in terms of like combat and things. Like they were useful in terms of traversing the environment because they could use abilities to clear stuff out of your way. And of course they chime in with interesting things to say on quests and whatnot, which is great. But combat-wise, they didn't feel particularly useful. Another concern of mine is the $70 price tag, which you may have seen. They announced pre-orders for Avowed not all that long ago, and we saw the $70 base price and a premium edition that comes with a bunch of stuff, as well as a few days early access to it. I don't love the price increase, especially since this is already going to be on Game Pass day one, and frankly, in order for this to justify that price tag, I think the game would have to knock it out of the park, because increased prices come with increased expectations, and while that's certainly a possibility, I haven't played the entire game yet, it's still not something I love to see, and time will tell how that actually winds up panning out. So altogether, I had a pretty good time with it, but I still have some concerns, of course. Now, I will be the first person to tell you that I would have preferred Pillars of Eternity 3 all day, every day, but it's no secret Pillars 2 especially did not sell particularly well. Now, from there, let's move on to the interviews and some discussions I had with various team members over at Obsidian, but I want to kick this off by setting the stage a little bit, and a little bit of self-critique, actually. So, as I'd never really done anything like this before, I was a bit ill-prepared for the interview portion of things, because A, I don't interview people really, but also in terms of equipment. But now I know what to expect. I would say that if something like this ever comes up again, I'll be a little more prepared, in particular setting up, something to allow me to properly audio record these, because these were mostly just conversations I had with developers where I took a bunch of notes that I'm now going to relay to you about various things I had the chance to ask questions about. So while they were very interesting conversations, I do feel like I could have done better in terms of taking, exactly what these people were saying in the form of like recorded audio as an example and bringing it to you that way. So fully admit that one's on me, bit of an experience on my part. But nonetheless, had the chance to ask a bunch of very specific questions, which I naturally did. And so we'll be breaking these down by, who I was having the interview with and the subject itself. Now, we kicked off these interviews by talking with Carrie Patel, the game director, talking about the overall direction of the game. This is where I got to ask questions like, for instance, were they planning on supporting modding? Were they optimizing for the Steam Deck? That type of stuff. So on the modding question, no, but I figured it was worth asking, especially since, games like Fallout New Vegas from Obsidian have obviously been modded quite a bit. So I was curious if there was going to be any full support for that, or if they, had anything like that planned. And the short answer is not really. Someone else asked about DLC as well, and, pretty standard answer there of we're worried about release right now and we'll worry about that later, just in case you were wondering. I also had the opportunity to ask if anything like ciphers or chanters came up later in a way that wasn't directly related to your character, and again, the answer seemed to be not really, just in case you happened to play Pillars previously, which was also the case for optimizing for the Steam Deck. It wasn't like a specific focus of theirs outside of just, generally how well things run on there. The rest of this particular conversation was centered around just various specific topics directly related to Pillars, as Carrie Patel had worked on the Pillars series previously before becoming game director of this game. So a lot of the rest of this interview outside of those things was more directed towards things that were then later expounded upon by other interviews. For instance, we talked a little bit about the push to make combat feel better, but then I interviewed people for combat later who went into a bit more depth on that and how they went like frame by frame trying to improve it alongside some of those narrative threads. So for instance, our godlike character seems to primarily be able to pick from like fungal growths in terms of what their physical manifestation of their god is, which is not typically represented as the normal pantheon of Eora. And then we see a lot of rot and death and decay via things like the Dream Scourge and the Living Lands. And we talked a bit about how those things, the juxtaposition of life versus death in the Living Lands itself, alongside the colonization, which has come up again as a theme. It was huge in Deadfire, and what that meant for the series overall. Especially since they wanted to avoid, of course, repeating outright what Deadfire itself already did. So in a lot of ways, with the theme they're going for here is how those two things coexist and lead to transformation. At least that was my interpretation of this. But there's a lot of clear narrative threads there, I would say, if you're familiar with this series. Another thing I got to ask about was animancy and how that was viewed going forward for the series if there was another game after this one. And for the most part, I would say it seems like they see animancy as a means to an end. Basically a tool to facilitate the story with, which would make sense, and animancy, for anyone who doesn't know, is the study of soul magic in this world. Now, following on from this, I interviewed Ash Kumar, who is the visual effects lead, as well as Ryan Warden, the game's production director, about the third-person camera, which was a really interesting interview, because I was able to ask a bunch of questions about third-person, obviously. So right away, they talked about how the third-person view was always planned from the beginning of the game's development, which I thought was especially interesting because they didn't actually show it for quite some time. It was confirmed much later on. So I got the chance to ask, what was the idea there behind holding back on, announcing that. And the general gist of it seemed to be that it was just kind of the natural way they wanted to present things, because they see the game as being primarily first person, even though third person is available. And for the most part, from firsthand experience, I would say it feels pretty good to play that. So it seemed to be more of just how they wanted to expand upon things rather than say a miss in marketing. But a really interesting thing about the third person part is that first person is like their master set of animations, if that makes sense, which means all the animations they did for third person had to fit within the timings and things of the first person viewpoint. And that's important because some of those animations look drastically different, as doing a whirlwind in first person versus third person is very different animation wise, but the timings still have to work out. But this also came up in ways you might not expect. Now, some obvious things are like throwing projectiles. Obviously there's a reticle on screen where your target goes, but when you switch to third person, that immediately has to be changed to adjust. And even here in third person, I think they did a good job with that. But it comes up in ways you might also not expect. For instance, swimming and things. When you're not in first person in some of those situations, it can be hard to see where you're going, but they still want third person to actually work in those situations. And so they leaned into things like bioluminescence underwater in order to make things more visually clear even when you're in that mode. Another part of that was like directing things that are in your face in first person, like for instance bubbles that might be underwater, and how that has to change and be appropriate for each type. Another aspect of this was how, of course, the change in perspective affects your ability to interact with the environment beyond just the visuals. For instance, how easy it is to pick up tiny objects. And for this, it seems like wherever your reticle is in third person is like exactly where the interact option pops up. So if you want to point that at something very small, you can still pick it up relatively easily. And then another part of it was just the actual camera. For whatever reason, one of the early bugs they had to contend with was the camera in certain situations wouldn't respect, like, say, collision detection on walls, meaning that if you were crafty, you could sort of get the camera through a wall you wouldn't be able to normally see and then potentially interact with things on the other side. And then lastly, we talked about how they had to use, certain light accessibility features in order to make things more clear. In particular, they wanted to really signpost the main path through the game. So when you think of things like, say, yellow paint or whatever else games kind of highlight that with, that is a little bit true for the main path. For instance, a lot of areas you can climb have like this sort of white line that looks relatively natural, but it stands out. But if you want to find a lot of hidden stuff, that stuff isn't signposted at all. In fact, there's a lot of hidden stuff that I experienced over the course of this little preview that, you can't really see it unless you go looking for it. So basically, they wanted to use a blend of making the path forward or the path through the main story in particular as obvious as they could make it without being kind of ridiculous, but also making sure that, a lot of the hidden stuff was just that, hidden. You actually had to go find it. And I thought that was a really interesting conversation to have. Now, following on from this, I had an interview about combat with gameplay director Gabe Paramo, as well as senior combat designer Maxwell Matzenbacher, which I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. These guys were, of course, heavily involved as, combat and gameplay in the decision to go through combat basically frame by frame after that initial showing in order to respond to the feedback that it didn't feel very impactful. And, of course, some of the things that went into making each bit of that feel a little better. And having played the game, I think they were mostly successful on that particular front. Now, another thing I was able to ask these guys about was the decision for a classless-based system. And some of that comes down to flexibility, trying to remove restrictions to the player and the way you want to play the game, but also stuff like scope and things that just didn't make sense, as I alluded to much earlier. So right away, flexibility basically being a big reason. Multi-classing is part of the previous Pillars games, 2 in particular, and trying to blend that stuff together in a way that felt fun, but also didn't unnecessarily restrict you from, say, finding something and not being able to use it was a big part of it. In fact, if you're, say, using a bow or something, there isn't like an ammunition counter you have to keep track of. You can just use it. And so removing stuff like that in the friction to gameplay was a big focus here, as well as just trying to make sure it felt fun. Now, as I mentioned much earlier, ciphers and enchanters aren't in the game, and I was able to ask about why that was, and as I mentioned, the answer here really was just that a lot of it didn't seem to make sense in a more action-oriented system. But some of it certainly was scope, like the druid shapeshifts as an example, because those would have had to been animated both in first person but also third person, and that was, obviously a ton of work for something that only a small fraction of players might have chosen to engage with anyway. So there was that. Now, some other stuff I got to talk to them about was, balancing around certain types of combat and some of the weapons available. For instance, they talked about how the dual wielding in particular needed a bit of a balancing pass at first because it was extremely strong, especially the dual pistols where you would just be shooting everything down before it really got a chance to react to you. So those were some fun conversations as well. And then when I talked about difficulty earlier, a lot of that information comes directly from these guys, as they want to avoid enemies feeling like, bullet sponges, and that balancing was still ongoing a little bit since release is a bit away. way, but in particular, they wanted difficulty to be more about putting pressure on the player and making sure you're utilizing the systems rather than just being a straight increase in, say, health, as they don't want the difficulty going up to simply mean that you're hacking away at an enemy forever, as opposed to it meaningfully challenging you in some way. So it'll be cool to see if they manage to bring that one home in the final version. And then the last thing I wanted to mention here is we talked a bit about equipment and companions and how their role will be in combat. But in regards to equipment in particular, at least on normal, they want equipment, like, the gear you're using, to be impactful but not necessarily required, as opposed to something like Path of the Damned where, understanding how things work and utilizing the best stuff would be more of a requirement. So to give an example of this, I found a ring that would turn all of my crit damage into poison, which seemed to be extremely effective, and that's one of the bits of gear you could say then go around and build a poison-based build off of. There were other items like gloves that increased sneak attack damage, or I even found a ring that would just passively heal you while you were in water. So the gist of it is they want equipment to feel impactful and potentially be a fun way to alter a build without being explicitly required for something like, say, just a regular old playthrough at the same time, which seems like an appropriate balance to make there. Now, my second to last round of interviews was with the visual effects team, and more specifically the lead environment artist Dennis Presnell, as well as art director Matt Hansen. And these guys, of course, talked about the visual language and everything at play in Avowed. Now, a lot of these conversations can be, I would say, a little bit difficult to put entirely into a format like this, but luckily you can see a lot of it happening on screen as we discuss these things. But we talked a lot about how, the themes of rot and decay were there and how those were juxtaposed against, obviously, signs of life like the Living Lands is known for, its kind of lush, overgrown nature, and how they wanted a lot of that to look, real to some degree, but also fantastical at the same time. In particular, there is, I would say, a very almost uncomfortably real-looking cinematic towards the beginning of it where we see a creature die and then be brought back by the Dream Scourge as this sort of rotted monstrosity. And that was kind of what they were going for. They don't want to push it over the line into the territory of too gross, but they basically want to show that something is not right here, and while it might be magical or soul-related, it still has a real tangible effect because these maladies of the soul are then being physically represented and manifested in the real world these characters are living in. I also got the chance to ask about how the experience translating something that was previously shown as an isometric environment into something 3D and fully explorable, and about, what went into making that a reality. And some of what they talked about here was sort of subconsciously pushing people towards certain areas without actually requiring you to go there. So there's a lot of roots and everything in this world, and some of that will sort of generally push towards a certain direction you might want to explore, as well as some of that information I talked about earlier in terms of marking paths and how they wanted the critical path to be very obvious in its presentation, but also that there were all sorts of side paths and tons of explorable content that you'll only find if you're looking for it. Especially since in the previous games, the Living Lands doesn't actually physically make an appearance, and so they had to turn this place that was almost mythologized into a real place and what that would actually look like with its dramatic landscapes and sweeping environments, and obviously this place hasn't been fully explored really, and so they could go back through those previous games and basically see anywhere the Living Lands was mentioned and turn those references into real places that you could explore, which I thought was really interesting. But probably the most impactful thing to come from this particular interview was talking about how they were representing cultures in a place that, really doesn't have a lot of them, as basically everyone we run into, especially in Dawnshore, is new to the Living Lands. And, how do you differentiate between the Steel Garrote, the Adiran Empire, the people who were just living here briefly before, as the Living Lands was often a refuge for people to escape from persecution elsewhere. So deserters like Kai, for instance, would come here just to get away from everyone else. And how the visual language there was able to readily identify all these people, not only to me, somebody who knows what these people are, but actually someone new to the game as a whole might be able to readily tell between them. And one of the ways is obviously heraldry. This is a sort of medieval level of fantasy, and heraldry is a big part of that, colors of course, but also more immediate effects go into this. For instance, the first area we're in, Dawnshore, the city there, Paradise, has a shanty town outside of it where a lot of the native people, so to speak, were pushed out recently from the actual city by the Adirans. So they're trying to use little moments like that to push forward the divisions between these people and set up some of their stories, of course, in a way that relies not so much directly on the environment, because a lot of that's supposed to be wild and overgrown. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation, and I wanted to share it with you guys. And then last but not least, we had an interview about content with narrative designer Kate Dollarhide and senior area designer and region director Berto Ritger. So this was a really interesting interview centered around obviously the content of the game and the story. So right away, one of the first questions I wanted to ask here was about where this game takes place in the grander scheme of, Pillars of Eternity. So in particular, Avowed takes place shortly after Pillars of Eternity 2, which means the big effect that happens at the end of that game has yet to be fully realized in the world, but we will see a lot of people reference those events and the more immediate fallout. For instance, I mentioned earlier that all the godlike seem to have disappeared. That's a direct result of that. In fact, if you've played Pillars of Eternity 2 all the way through, you should know exactly why the godlike are missing. Now, I have some more theories about this that I don't want to go into here. I'll talk more about that in that story speculation video I mentioned, but it is greatly of note to me at the very least. Another part of this is that in exploring all of those different, bits of detail about the Pillars universe, they want to try to avoid exposition where possible. They basically don't want you to walk up to a character and be met with walls upon walls of text and voice acting, trying to explain all this stuff from the previous games or just the world at large. And they do this by, of course, utilizing that in-dialogue dictionary where you can look up terms on your own, but also by trying to focus on the relevancy of things at certain times. For instance, you don't necessarily need the full backstory on the Adiran Empire right away. You can kind of just get the gist of it with the story setup. And then, things like the Steel Garrote. You just really need to know that they're paladins of Vodica. And they try to make sure they're only giving you the relevant information to a given situation to avoid overloading people, which is a lot of the work that went into, say, the prologue in particular. And another way they do that, speaking of the prologue, is with each zone that you'll be in having a sort of theme or a central pillar that they're going to explore, like, say, Animancy in the Emerald Stair, which was previously discussed. Or, of course, the divisions caused by the Adirans' arrival in the Living Lands being a big part of Dawnshore. So thematic elements to every place you're in that explore these things a little more, I would say, bite-sized, while of course advancing the main plot at the same time, which seems to have worked out, at least in what I've played of it. And then of course there's things like, player choice being represented. We talked about how it's important to see the choices you've made as a player be represented in the game, and in some cases this just means letting you follow through on things you're choosing to do. For instance, in the Dawn Treader quest, there's a part of it at the end where you can basically just sign up to die. And if you choose to do that, the game will just outright kill you and give you a game over right there, which is really funny to me because they've also done that previously in some quests in the Pillars games. So through iteration and feedback, they always try to make sure that whatever the player is choosing to do or trying to do, where it makes sense at least, is going to be properly represented and respected as that story progresses forward. So I thought that was really cool and interesting. I really liked that interview a lot. But believe it or not, that is where we are going to finally wrap up this particular video and this preview of Avowed. Now, that said, as a reminder, in case you just skipped to the end here, I will have some more videos following up on this. There are some topics I want to discuss a little more in depth that didn't make sense for this more overview-oriented video with as long as it already is. So hopefully you enjoyed all this. If you want more Avowed content, definitely subscribe and stick around. It is my most anticipated game. I love the setting it is in. And while I certainly have a few concerns and criticisms, I'm genuinely looking forward to playing more of this one. So hopefully you found all of that interesting and got answers to the questions you were after. But for right now, that is pretty much gonna do it. But certainly don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.